The Skylight Hotel, an architectural marvel nestled in the heart of a bustling city, opened its gleaming doors on a crisp October evening. Designed by the reclusive genius Sebastian Crowley, the hotel promised to be more than a place to stay. It was an experience. The facade shimmered with glass panels that reflected the city's skyline, creating an illusion that the building itself floated on air. Inside, its pristine marble floors and golden accents whispered promises of luxury and opulence. Invitations to the grand opening were scarce, handed out only to the elite, the influential, and those willing to pay exorbitantly for exclusivity. From the moment guests stepped onto the plush crimson carpet leading to the entrance, they were enveloped in an intoxicating atmosphere. Photographers snapped pictures of celebrities in designer gowns and tuxedos, their faces glowing under the warm light of chandeliers crafted to resemble falling stars. The buzz in the air was palpable, fueled by whispers of the hotel's rumored secrets. An infinity pool suspended mid-air, suites with customizable weather settings, and the enigmatic Velvet Room, whose purpose was teased but never fully disclosed. Among the crowd was Lila Monroe, a popular travel blogger known for her sharp wit and unfiltered reviews. She had been skeptical of the Skylight's hype, having seen her fair share of luxury hotels. Yet as she entered the lobby, her breath caught. It was as though the building had a heartbeat of its own, its design pulsating with an energy that was both inviting and unnervingly alive. "It's as if the walls are watching us," Lila murmured to her companion, a photographer named Derek. He laughed, brushing off her comment, but the glint of unease in his eyes betrayed him. The evening's itinerary was a carefully orchestrated affair. Guests were led through the hotel by uniformed staff whose smiles seemed rehearsed to perfection. The Skylight's amenities were unveiled like scenes in a theatrical production. A dining hall, where holographic projections of oceans and forests danced across the walls, a glass bridge that offered vertigo-inducing views of the city below, and suites that adjusted lighting and temperature based on the mood of their occupants. Each feature was met with gasps of awe, yet an undercurrent of something unspoken lingered. Near the end of the tour, the group arrived at the Velvet Room, the hotel's crown jewel. The entrance was guarded by two massive bronze doors, adorned with carvings of outstretched hands reaching toward a swirling void. A hotel representative explained that the room was a multi-sensory lounge, but the vagueness of the description only added to its mystique. When the doors creaked open, a gust of cool air escaped, carrying with it a faint, metallic scent. Inside, the room was bathed in a dim red light, its walls covered in fabric so lush it seemed to absorb sound. Guests were invited to recline on velvet couches while sampling exotic cocktails served in glassware that refracted the light like prisms. Lila couldn't shake the sensation of being observed, as if the room had a consciousness. She leaned closer to Derek and whispered, "Do you feel that?" He shrugged, but the sweat forming on his brow betrayed him again. As the evening progressed, the hotel's atmosphere grew heavier. The initial euphoria gave way to subtle unease, as if the building's splendor concealed something darker. A tech mogul excused himself abruptly, muttering about needing fresh air, but the concierge gently reminded him that leaving before midnight was against the rules of the event. His laughter echoed awkwardly, tinged with disbelief, but he stayed. At the stroke of 10, a sudden power outage plunged the Skylight into darkness. Gasps and murmurs filled the air, but before panic could take hold, the lights flickered back on. The hotel staff reassured the guests that it was a minor glitch, yet Lila noticed something odd. The holographic oceans in the dining hall now displayed stormy waves, and the trees in the forest projection swayed violently, as if reacting to an unseen wind. By the time the evening ended, an unsettling silence had replaced the earlier excitement. Guests returned to their rooms, their enthusiasm dampened by the inexplicable events. Lila, unable to sleep, sat by her window overlooking the city. As she gazed at the skyline, she caught a reflection in the glass. Not of her room, but of the Velvet Room. Its doors were open, and shadows moved within, shapes that shouldn't have been there. Down the hall, Derek paced in his suite, reviewing the photos he'd taken that evening. In every image of the Velvet Room, There was a faint, blurry figure standing in the background, always in the same spot, its head tilted as if observing him. He rubbed his eyes and checked again, but the figure remained, unwavering and menacing. The Skylight Hotel's grand opening was destined to be remembered, but not for the reasons its creators intended. For the guests who entered that night, it was the beginning of a nightmare they could never leave behind. The Velvet Room quickly became the most discussed feature of the Skylight Hotel. Though all attendees from the grand opening spoke of its opulence, none could agree on what exactly transpired within its blood-red walls. Some described a feeling of serene detachment, as if floating in a dream. Others whispered of oppressive dread, like being swallowed by an unseen force. For Lila Monroe, the room had been a strange paradox, inviting yet unervingly foreign, as though it belonged to a realm not meant for human presence. The following morning, guests gathered in the lavish dining hall for breakfast. The dining area, with its towering windows and panoramic views of the city, was designed to evoke calm. Yet the mood was anything but tranquil. Conversations were hushed, and eyes darted nervously toward the Velvet Room's bronze doors, which remained closed. Even the ever-smiling staff seemed subdued, their movements less fluid, their faces tight with something akin to fear. Lila sipped her coffee, her fingers trembling slightly as she scrolled through the photos Derek had taken the previous night. The blurry figure in the Velvet Room appeared in each shot, its posture eerily unchanged. She debated showing the images to Derek but hesitated. He had been distant since the power outage, brushing off her attempts at conversation with curt replies. Something had unsettled him deeply, though he refused to admit it. Halfway through breakfast, a shrill scream pierced the air. Every head turned toward the sound, which came from a young couple standing near the Velvet Room. The woman, pale and shaking, clutched her partner's arm as she pointed toward the bronze doors. It moved, she stammered. Her partner tried to calm her, but his own expression betrayed his fear. The door, it moved by itself, she insisted. A concierge hurried over, his composure strained but intact. I assure you, ma'am, the doors are securely locked, he said, his tone placating. Yet as the crowd stared, the doors emitted a low groan, as though straining against an invisible force. The concierge froze, his professional demeanor faltering. Perhaps it's the air pressure, he added weakly, but no one believed him. The incident cast a pall over the day. Guests who had planned to explore the city instead lingered in the lobby or their rooms, their curiosity tinged with apprehension. Lila, however, couldn't shake the feeling that something was actively pulling her back to the Velvet Room. She decided to investigate, hoping to unravel the growing mystery. She approached the bronze doors cautiously, her heart pounding in her chest. Up close, the carvings of outstretched hands seemed almost lifelike, as though they were pressing against the metal from the other side. She placed her palm on the door, half expecting it to feel warm, but it was cold, colder than it should have been. For a moment, she thought she heard faint whispers, too soft to decipher. Are you planning to go inside? The voice startled her, and she turned to see Derek standing behind her, his camera slung over his shoulder. His face was pale, and his eyes held a nervous energy. You've been avoiding me, Lila said, trying to mask her relief at seeing him. Derek shrugged, his gaze fixed on the door. I didn't sleep last night. Those photos, something isn't right. Before she could reply, the concierge appeared, his footsteps unnaturally quiet on the marble floor. I'm sorry, but the Velvet Room is off limits for now, he said, his tone firm but polite. Lila noted the beads of sweat on his forehead, despite the hotel's cool temperature. Why? Is there a problem? She asked. The concierge hesitated, then offered a rehearsed smile. Routine maintenance, he replied, though his darting eyes betrayed him. As the day wore on, rumors swirled among the guests. Some claimed the Velvet Room was cursed, while others speculated it was an elaborate stunt designed to drum up publicity. Lila remained skeptical, but couldn't ignore the unease gnawing at her. That evening, she returned to her suite and replayed the events in her mind. The images, the whispers, the unnatural cold, they all pointed to something beyond explanation. At precisely midnight, A soft knock at her door jolted her awake. She froze, her pulse quickening. Peering through the peephole, she saw no one. But when she opened the door, a single key lay on the floor, its brass surface gleaming under the hallway's dim light. It was marked with the number 999, a room that didn't exist. Lila stared at the key lying on the carpet outside her suite. Her initial thought was that someone was playing a prank. But the cold weight of the brass in her hand, its intricate design, and the engraving of 999 suggested otherwise. She glanced down the empty corridor, her pulse quickening as an inexplicable sense of anticipation gripped her. A non-existent room? She thought. She'd thoroughly studied the hotel's floor plan before the opening. It was part of her routine when reviewing luxury properties, and she knew there were no rooms numbered beyond 888. Returning inside, Lila examined the key under the light. Its surface gleamed like it had been freshly polished, but the ornate design gave it an antiquated feel, as though it belonged to another era. A faint metallic scent clung to it, stirring an uncomfortable familiarity in her, a scent she recognized from the Velvet Room. She considered calling Derek, but his withdrawn demeanor earlier in the day made her hesitate. This, whatever it was, she needed to investigate alone. Her curiosity outweighed her fear. She grabbed her phone and a small flashlight from her bag, slipping the key into her pocket. As she stepped into the hallway, the air felt heavier, almost oppressive. The muted hum of the hotel's ambient music seemed to have vanished, replaced by an unsettling silence. The corridor stretched before her, its end shrouded in shadow, despite the soft glow of the sconces lining the walls. As she walked, Lila noticed something strange. The hallway seemed longer than it had during the day. The familiar turn leading to the elevators felt impossibly distant. Her footsteps, muted on the thick carpet, sounded louder in her ears, like an echo from another world. Just as she began to wonder if she was imagining things, she saw it. A door marked 999. The door stood alone at the end of the corridor, its frame slightly crooked, as if it had been wedged into place hastily. Unlike the other polished oak doors, this one was weathered, its paint peeling to reveal splinters of dark wood beneath. The brass numbers affixed to the surface were tarnished, their edges green with oxidation. Lila hesitated, her hand hovering over the key in her pocket. She glanced back, half expecting to see someone watching, but the hallway behind her was empty. With a deep breath, she inserted the key into the lock. The mechanism turned smoothly, and the door creaked open, revealing a pitch-black interior. The faint metallic scent she'd noticed earlier was stronger now, mingling with an earthy musk that made her stomach churn. Lila switched on her flashlight and stepped inside. The room was unlike anything she had expected. Instead of the opulent design that characterized the rest of the hotel, Room 999 was stark and decrepit. The walls were lined with faded wallpaper, its floral pattern barely visible beneath layers of grime. A single chair sat in the center of the room, its wooden legs warped as though they'd been exposed to water. In one corner, a shattered mirror leaned against the wall, its fragments reflecting distorted images of the room. As Lila moved the beam of her flashlight across the space, she realized the room wasn't empty. The walls were covered in photographs, hundreds, perhaps thousands, pinned haphazardly like a macabre collage. Each image depicted a person or group, their faces frozen in expressions of joy or shock, but something was wrong. The edges of the photos were burned, and in each image, a shadowy figure loomed in the background, barely discernible but undeniably present. Her breath caught when she recognized one of the photos. It was from the Skylight's grand opening, a candid shot of her and Derek standing in the Velvet Room. The shadowy figure hovered just behind her, its head tilted in that same unnatural way. The realization sent a chill down her spine. She frantically scanned the other images, spotting more familiar faces. Guests she had seen at the hotel, the staff, even the concierge. A faint sound broke the silence, a low, rhythmic tapping. It came from the chair in the center of the room. Lila's flashlight trembled as she directed it toward the sound. The chair, empty just moments ago, now had something resting on it, a small leather-bound book. She hadn't seen it before. Her heart pounded as she stepped closer, her instincts screaming for her to leave. The book's cover was blank except for a single symbol embossed in gold: the swirling void she had seen carved into the Velvet Room's doors. As she reached out to pick it up, the door to room 999 slammed shut behind her. The tapping grew louder, transforming into an erratic pounding that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The shadows in the room lengthened, creeping toward her as though alive. Lila clutched the book and bolted for the door, yanking it open with a strength she didn't know she had. She stumbled into the hallway, her breath ragged. The corridor was just as she had left it, but the door to room 999 was gone. In its place was a blank section of wall, as if the door had never existed. The key in her pocket was cold against her skin, a chilling reminder that what she had experienced was real. As she retreated to her suite, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had crossed into something she wasn't meant to see. The photographs, the book, the shadows, all of it pointed to a truth the Skylight Hotel was determined to hide. And Lila, whether she liked it or not, was now a part of its story. Lila locked her suite door behind her, leaning against it as if to block the invisible forces that had followed her from room 999. Her hands trembled as she held the small leather-bound book, its weight oddly disproportionate to its size. She placed it on the desk by the window, glaring at it as if it might spring to life. Outside, the city twinkled with artificial serenity, but Lila knew better now. The Skylight Hotel wasn't just a building. It was alive, and it had taken notice of her. She paced the room, debating whether to open the book. Every instinct screamed against it, yet her curiosity gnawed at her resolve. The symbol on the cover, the swirling void, seemed to pulse faintly under the lamplight, drawing her closer. Unable to resist, she sat down and cautiously lifted the cover. The pages inside were brittle and yellowed, covered in handwritten notes and sketches. At first glance, the writing appeared incoherent, snatches of sentences, fragments of thoughts. But as Lila read, the words seemed to rearrange themselves, forming a cohesive narrative in her mind. The book told the story of the Skylight Hotel's construction, but the tale was far from ordinary. The original architect, a man named Elias Moorcroft, had been obsessed with creating a space that defied reality, a portal between worlds. The book described how Moorcroft had incorporated ancient symbols and rituals into the hotel's design, drawing on forbidden knowledge to infuse the building with a unique energy. The Velvet Room, it claimed, was the centerpiece of this design, a gateway to something beyond human comprehension. But the book was also a warning. Moorcroft had vanished during the hotel's final stages of construction, leaving behind cryptic notes about shadows that cannot be escaped and the room that sees all. Lila's breath hitched as she turned the page to find a sketch of the Velvet Room's bronze doors. The intricate carvings of hands matched perfectly, but beneath them, Moorcroft had scrawled a chilling message. They reach because they remember. They remember because they were lost. The words sent a shiver down her spine. Who or what had been lost? And what did they want with the hotel's guests? Suddenly, a faint whisper filled the room. Lila froze, her eyes darting toward the source of the sound. It seemed to emanate from the book, growing louder as she leaned closer. The words were indistinct, but the tone was insistent, pleading. She slammed the book shut, silencing the whispers, and stumbled back from the desk. Her heart raced as the air grew heavy, the same oppressive weight she had felt in room 999. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand, jolting her out of her panic. Grateful for the distraction, she grabbed it and saw a text from Derek. "Meet me in the lobby. Something's wrong." She hesitated, glancing at the book. Could she trust Derek? He'd been acting strangely ever since the grand opening, but she couldn't deny she needed an ally. Stuffing the book into her bag, she headed for the door. The elevator ride to the lobby felt interminable. The mirrored walls reflected her anxious expression, but something about the reflections unsettled her. They seemed delayed, slightly out of sync with her movements. She avoided looking at them, focusing instead on the illuminated numbers counting down to the ground floor. When the doors finally opened, the lobby was eerily quiet, devoid of the usual bustle of guests and staff. She spotted Derek near the concierge desk, his face pale and drawn. He held his camera tightly, his knuckles white against the black casing. "What's going on?" Lila demanded, her voice sharper than intended. Derek looked around nervously before answering. "I tried leaving the hotel," he said. "I went out the front door, but I ended up back in the hallway outside my room." The weight of his words hit her like a physical blow. "That's impossible," she whispered, though deep down, she knew it wasn't. Derek gestured toward the concierge desk, where a small pile of objects sat. Guest keycards, passports, phones. "I'm not the only one," he said. "Other people have tried. None of them made it past the doors." Lila felt the world tilt beneath her feet. The Skylight Hotel wasn't just haunted. It was a trap, and they were all caught in its web. Her fingers tightened around the strap of her bag, the book inside pressing against her side. She didn't know why, but she felt certain it held the key to understanding what was happening. And if they were going to escape, she would need to face whatever secrets the book was desperate to reveal. Derek's revelation about the hotel's inescapable grip settled like a lead weight in Lila's chest. She glanced around the lobby, taking in the eerie stillness. The fountain in the center had stopped flowing, its water frozen mid-cascade. The front desk was abandoned, but the computer screen glowed faintly, displaying an unintelligible sequence of numbers and letters. Every detail of the Skylight Hotel seemed designed to unsettle, and now the illusion of normalcy had shattered entirely. "Lila," Derek said, his voice low but urgent, "I think the Velvet Room is the key." She stiffened at the mention of it, her memory flashing back to the oppressive atmosphere of room 999. "Why would you say that?" she asked, her voice trembling. Derek raised his camera, flipping through photos. "I've been documenting everything strange since the grand opening. Look." He showed her a series of photos taken in different parts of the hotel: the ballroom, the rooftop lounge, the main staircase. In each one, a faint outline of the bronze hands from the Velvet Room's doors was visible, etched into surfaces where they didn't belong. "They're everywhere," Derek said, his tone verging on panic. "The Velvet Room isn't just a room. It's spreading." Lila felt a wave of nausea as she processed his words. She reached in her bag, pulling out the leather-bound book. "This might explain it," she said, handing it to Derek. He flipped through the pages, his brow furrowing. "Elias Moorcroft," he murmured, reading aloud. "The architect disappeared during construction. They said he went mad, claiming the building would become a bridge to another world." Derek paused, his finger tracing a sketch of the Velvet Room's doors. "A bridge to what exactly?" he asked. Lila shook her head, fear clawing at her. "I don't know, but whatever it is, it's not friendly." She leaned closer to Derek, lowering her voice. "We need to figure this out fast. If we're trapped here," she didn't finish the thought. The possibility of never leaving the hotel was too horrifying to articulate. As they spoke, a faint humming noise began to fill the air. It was soft at first, almost imperceptible, but it grew louder with each passing second. Lila turned toward the sound, her eyes widening. The bronze doors of the Velvet Room were glowing faintly, a pulsating light seeping from the intricate carvings. "Did you touch the doors?" Derek asked sharply. Lila shook her head. "No, but I was inside room 999 earlier." The energy in there was. She stopped, realizing she couldn't adequately describe the oppressive, sentient atmosphere of the room. Derek's face darkened. "You opened something," he said. "That room must be connected to the Velvet Room." The humming grew louder, and Lila felt her ears pop as the pressure in the lobby shifted. The bronze doors creaked open slightly, revealing a sliver of impenetrable darkness. A rush of cold air spilled into the lobby, carrying with it a cacophony of whispers. The voices overlapped, speaking in a language that was both alien and disturbingly familiar. Derek stepped back, his grip tightening on his camera. "We can't ignore this," he said, his voice trembling. "If Moorcroft was right, if this is some kind of gateway," he trailed off, unable to finish the thought. Lila stared at the doors, her mind racing. The book's warnings echoed in her head. They reach because they remember. They remember because they were lost. "We need answers," she said finally, her voice steady despite the fear coiling in her chest. She grabbed the book and approached the velvet room, each step feeling like a leap into the abyss. Derek followed reluctantly, his camera raised as if it could protect him. The whispers grew louder, their urgency palpable. Standing before the half-open doors, Lila hesitated. She glanced back at Derek, who gave a reluctant nod. Together, they pushed the doors open, stepping into the darkness beyond. The air inside was thick and cold, clinging to their skin like a second layer. As the doors closed behind them with an ominous thud, the whispers fell silent, replaced by a deep, resonant voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. "Welcome," it said, the word reverberating in their bones. "You have found what was meant to remain hidden. Now, you must see." The room was no longer empty. Figures began to emerge from the shadows, their forms flickering like projections. Lila and Derek exchanged a terrified glance, realizing too late that they were no longer the observers. They were the observed. The moment the velvet room's doors closed behind them, Lila and Derek were plunged into an oppressive silence that amplified every breath and heartbeat. The air was dense, suffused with a cold that seemed to seep into their bones. The darkness pressed against them, but it wasn't total. Subtle, shifting glimmers appeared and disappeared, like faint sparks on the edges of perception. "Do you see that?" Derek whispered, his voice almost swallowed by the heavy stillness. Lila nodded, her eyes straining to make sense of the shapes that flickered around them. The room didn't feel like a room at all. It felt vast, endless, as if the walls had dissolved into infinity. The glimmers began to coalesce into forms. At first, they were indistinct, mere shadows moving on the periphery of their vision. Then, they sharpened into humanoid shapes, though their proportions were wrong. Elongated arms, heads tilted at unnatural angles, movements that defied logic. The figures didn't walk. They glided, silent and deliberate, their forms flickering as though caught between worlds. Lila clutched the book tightly to her chest, her knuckles white. The whispers had returned, a faint murmur that ebbed and flowed like a tide. This time, the words were clearer, though still incomprehensible. Derek raised his camera, but the moment he clicked the shutter, a loud, echoing crack filled the room. The camera flew out of his hands, landing on the ground with a sickening crunch. "Don't," Lila said, her voice trembling. "They don't want us to document this." Derek nodded mutely, his eyes wide with fear. One of the figures began to drift closer, its flickering form becoming more defined. It had no face, only a smooth, featureless surface where its eyes and mouth should have been. Yet, Lila felt its gaze piercing through her, a weight that pressed down on her soul. "Who are you?" she managed to ask, her voice cracking. The figure tilted its head, and for a moment, the whispers coalesced into a single, intelligible phrase. "We are the forgotten." The words resonated in the air, reverberating like a haunting melody. The book in Lila's hands began to grow warm, the leather cover pulsating as if it had a heartbeat. She opened it instinctively, and the pages began to turn on their own, stopping on a sketch of a labyrinth. Beneath it, the caption read, "The path to freedom is through memory." "Memory?" Derek whispered, reading over her shoulder. "What does that mean?" Before Lila could respond, the figures began to move in unison, forming a circle around them. The air grew heavier, and the darkness seemed to ripple, like the surface of a disturbed pond. Suddenly, the room shifted. The infinite darkness was replaced by a distorted version of the Skylight Hotel's lobby. The furniture was warped, the colors muted and washed out. Shadows clung to every corner, deeper and more impenetrable than they should have been. The figures were gone, but their presence lingered, a suffocating weight that refused to dissipate. "Are we back?" Derek asked, his voice tinged with both hope and dread. Lila shook her head. "No, this isn't real. It's a memory." She gestured to the concierge desk, where a woman stood, her back turned to them. Her uniform was from another era, the fabric frayed and faded. As they approached, the woman turned, and Lila gasped. Her face was a shifting blur, as though it couldn't hold a solid form. "Help me," the woman said, her voice layered with anguish. "I can't leave. None of us can." She reached out, but her hand dissolved into mist before it could touch them. The lobby began to distort further, the walls stretching and twisting. Lila and Derek stumbled backward, their senses overwhelmed by the surreal spectacle. The whispers returned, louder and more insistent, and the book's pages began to glow faintly. Lila opened it again, finding a new passage written in the same erratic script. "The door is the key, but only through the truth will it open." "What truth?" Derek demanded, his frustration boiling over. "What are we supposed to do?" The shadows around them thickened, closing in, and the distorted lobby began to crumble like a decaying film reel. Lila clutched the book and made a desperate decision. "We have to follow the whispers," she said, her voice firm despite the terror clawing at her insides. "They're leading us somewhere. They want us to see something." With no other options, Derek nodded, and they began to move toward the source of the whispers, which seemed to emanate from a warped staircase spiraling into the void. As they ascended, the oppressive weight in the air grew. But so did Lila's determination. If this place held the truth, they would find it, even if it meant confronting the darkest depths of the hotel's horrifying secrets. The staircase was unlike any Lila and Derek had ever seen. It spiraled upward into a void where no ceiling should exist, its edges crumbling as though caught in an eternal state of decay. The faint glow of the book in Lila's hand served as their only light, casting eerie, fragmented shadows on the surrounding walls. Each step they took echoed hollowly, amplifying the emptiness around them. "Do you feel it?" Lila whispered, gripping the book as if it were a lifeline. "Feel what?" Derek asked, though his voice betrayed that he already knew the answer. "The weight. It's like something is pushing against me." Lila's voice faltered as she glanced down at the steps they had ascended. The staircase behind them dissolved into a smoky void, making it clear there was no turning back. As they climbed higher, the whispers grew louder, evolving into fragmented sentences spoken in overlapping voices. Some were pleading, others threatening, but all were filled with an unmistakable anguish. "It's pulling us somewhere," Lila muttered, her eyes darting between the book and the unending staircase ahead. After what felt like an eternity, they reached a landing. The air here was colder, sharper, and carried the scent of something metallic. A single wooden door stood before them, its surface covered in deep, claw-like scratches. Above it, scrawled in what looked like charcoal, were the words, "Through this door, the truth unravels." Derek hesitated, his hand hovering just above the doorknob. "What if we're not ready for this?" he asked, his voice cracking under the weight of his fear. Lila's resolve, however fragile, pushed her forward. "If we stop now, we'll never escape," she said, opening the book to another glowing passage. "The shadows you fear are memories misplaced. Unveil them, or remain forever lost." With a deep breath, Lila turned the doorknob. The door creaked open, revealing a dimly lit room that seemed strangely familiar. They stepped inside, the door slamming shut behind them with a deafening finality. The room was a distorted replica of the Skylight Hotel's ballroom. The chandeliers hung crookedly, their crystals clouded with grime. Tables and chairs were overturned, and the air was thick with the smell of mildew. But it wasn't the decay that unnerved them. It was the figures seated at the broken tables. They were guests, or rather, echoes of guests. Their faces were hollowed, their eyes black voids that stared blankly ahead. Some wore formal attire stained with dirt and ash. Others appeared in clothing from decades past. They moved sluggishly, as though trapped in an endless loop of ghostly revelry. This isn't real," Derek stammered, though his trembling hands betrayed his words. "It's their memories," Lila said, her voice barely audible. She stepped closer to the nearest table, where a man in a tattered tuxedo raised a glass filled with dark, viscous liquid. His mouth opened, but the sound that emerged was an otherworldly wail that sent chills racing down her spine. The book in her hands began to vibrate. When she opened it, the pages flipped on their own, stopping at a passage that read, "Ask them their truth, and they shall speak. Ask them? Derek hissed, shaking his head. Are you insane? Did you hear that? Lila ignored him, her curiosity outweighing her terror. She knelt beside the man in the tuxedo, her voice trembling as she asked, What happened to you? The man froze, his hollow eyes locking onto hers. The ballroom seemed to ripple, and suddenly, Lila was no longer standing in the decayed room. She was in the same ballroom, but it was vibrant, alive with the sounds of laughter and music. The chandeliers sparkled, and the tables were adorned with elaborate floral arrangements. The man in the tuxedo stood beside her, now whole, his face filled with dread. They locked us in, he said, his voice trembling with despair. They said the hotel was alive, feeding off our fears. We couldn't escape, those who tried. His sentence trailed off, and his form flickered, replaced once again by his hollow, decayed visage. The ballroom returned to its ruined state, and Lila stumbled backward, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The hotel, it's a trap, she whispered. We need to get out of here, Derek said, pulling her toward the door. But before they could reach it, the whispers rose to a deafening roar, and the ghostly figures all turned to face them. Their black voids of eyes seemed to pierce into their very souls. The room began to dissolve, the walls collapsing inward, and the floor beneath them gave way. Lila clutched the book tightly as they fell into a swirling abyss, the whispers transforming into a cacophony of screams. When they landed, the impact knocked the air from their lungs. They were in another part of the hotel now, though it was impossible to tell where. The walls were alive, pulsating like the veins of a giant creature. Lila looked at the book, its glow now faint and flickering. It's not just the memories, she said, her voice shaking. This place, it feeds on them. Derek stared at her, his face pale. And we're not just lost. We're part of its meal. When Lila and Derek regained their footing, the pulsating walls around them seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting as if the hotel itself were alive. The air was thick with a damp, organic smell, and the dim light from the book barely illuminated the space. The walls shimmered faintly, like a membrane stretched taut over something writhing beneath. It was as though they had fallen into the belly of some monstrous creature. Lila glanced at the book, its glow now weak and intermittent. It's losing power, she muttered, her voice quivering. She traced her fingers over the pages, hoping for a revelation, but the text had become smeared and unreadable. What do we do if it stops working? Derek shook his head, his jaw clenched. We move. Staying here isn't an option. His voice carried a hint of determination, but his eyes betrayed his growing despair. They pressed forward, the floor beneath them sticky and warm. Each step felt like it dragged them deeper into the hotel's unnatural heartbeat. The whispers that had plagued them earlier were gone, replaced by a low, rhythmic sound, like the thrum of a distant drum. Do you hear that? Derek asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Yes, Lila replied. It's coming from ahead. They followed the sound down a narrow, twisting corridor. The walls here were lined with what appeared to be veins, pulsing in time with the rhythmic beat. Lila reached out, hesitant, and lightly touched one of the veins. It recoiled at her touch, shrinking into the wall. She jerked her hand back, her heart pounding. This place, it's alive, she whispered, her words hanging in the suffocating air. The corridor opened into a vast chamber unlike anything they had seen before. In the center of the room stood a massive, grotesque structure, a tangle of sinewy flesh and glowing orbs that pulsated like organs. Surrounding it were dozens of shadowy figures, their forms indistinct, yet filled with an undeniable sense of menace. They moved with a collective purpose, tending to the grotesque mass as though it were their deity. What is that? Derek breathed, his voice trembling. I think it's the heart, Lila said, clutching the book to her chest. The heart of the hotel. As if sensing their presence, the shadowy figures stopped moving and turned toward them in unison. Their eyes glowed faintly, a sickly green that radiated malice. Lila and Derek froze, the weight of the figures' attention pressing down on them like a physical force. The book in Lila's hands began to glow brighter, its light growing until it was almost blinding. The shadows recoiled, hissing and retreating toward the walls. Lila took a tentative step forward, her courage bolstered by the book's renewed power. "Whatever this thing is, it's controlling the hotel," she said, her voice steady. "If we destroy it, we might destroy everything." Derek finished, his tone uncertain. Lila ignored his hesitation and flipped the book open. The glowing text had returned, and it displayed a single phrase, "Strike where it beats the loudest." Without waiting, she moved closer to the mass at the center of the chamber. The rhythmic thrum grew louder, almost deafening, as she approached. The shadowy figures began to stir, their movements erratic and agitated. "Lila, we need to think about this," Derek shouted, but she was already raising the book toward the mass. Before she could act, the fleshy heart pulsated violently, and the chamber began to quake. The floor beneath them split open, revealing an abyss that seemed to stretch endlessly downward. The shadowy figures lunged toward them, their glowing eyes filled with rage. Lila screamed as one of the figures grabbed her arm, its touch ice-cold and suffused with malice. Derek rushed forward, pulling her free and dragging her toward the edge of the chamber. The book fell from her grasp, landing near the pulsing mass. Its glow intensified, and a high-pitched whine filled the air. "We have to go," Derek shouted, pulling her away from the chaos. The book erupted in a brilliant flash of light, and the chamber was consumed by a blinding explosion. Lila and Derek barely made it through a collapsing passageway before the entire space behind them crumbled into nothingness. When they finally stopped running, gasping for breath, they found themselves in a quiet, sterile hallway that seemed utterly disconnected from the nightmare they had just escaped. The walls were smooth and white, the air still and cold. "Where are we?" Lila asked, her voice trembling. Derek shook his head. "I don't know, but I don't think the hotel's done with us yet." Lila and Derek stood in the pristine white corridor, the eerie silence wrapping around them like a suffocating shroud. The stark contrast to the pulsating, organic chaos they had fled only moments ago was disorienting. The walls, smooth and glowing faintly, seemed to hum with an energy that was neither comforting nor threatening. It simply existed, as though observing them in quiet anticipation. "We're not safe here," Lila said, her voice barely above a whisper. Her gaze darted around, searching for any indication of where they were. Derek nodded, his jaw tight. "Safe isn't part of the deal anymore. Let's keep moving." As they walked, their footsteps echoed unnaturally, as if the corridor stretched for miles in every direction. There were no doors, no windows, just an endless expanse of sterile white. Lila couldn't shake the feeling that the corridor was alive in its own way, not with pulsing veins, but with a cold, calculating awareness. After what felt like an eternity, they reached a fork in the corridor. Two identical paths stretched out before them, each indistinguishable from the other. Derek hesitated, his brow furrowed. "Which way?" Lila stepped forward, squinting down each path. "Wait," she said, pointing to the left. "Do you see that? There's something off." Derek followed her gaze. At first glance, both paths appeared identical, but as he stared down the left corridor, the faint hum of the walls grew louder, more agitated. The glow of the walls there seemed to flicker ever so slightly, like a faulty light bulb. "I don't like it," Derek said. "Let's go right." Lila frowned. "What if that's what the hotel wants us to do? The left path, it's different. Maybe that's the way out. Or maybe it's a trap," Derek countered. Before they could argue further, the hum from the left corridor escalated into a low rumble. The walls seemed to tremble, and a faint, shadowy figure emerged at the far end of the path. It was humanoid, but featureless, like a silhouette carved from the air itself. "Right," Derek said firmly, grabbing Lila's arm and pulling her toward the safer-looking corridor. As they hurried down the right path, the sound of footsteps echoed behind them, heavy and deliberate. Lila glanced back and saw the figure from the left corridor following them, its outline sharper now. Though it had no eyes, she felt its gaze burning into her. Faster, she urged. They broke into a run, but the corridor seemed to stretch endlessly. The sterile white walls began to shift, their smooth surfaces warping and rippling like water. The humming returned, louder and more menacing, as if the hotel itself was reacting to their presence. Just when it felt like they would be trapped in the corridor forever, a door materialized in the wall ahead of them. It was small and unremarkable, a simple wooden door that seemed laughably out of place in the pristine hallway. Without hesitation, Derek reached for the handle and yanked it open. They stumbled through and slammed the door shut behind them. The moment it clicked, the humming stopped. They were plunged into darkness, the silence so profound it was almost deafening. Lila fumbled for something to hold on to, her hands brushing against cold metal. A dim light flickered on, revealing their new surroundings. They were in a room filled with countless mirrors, each reflecting distorted versions of themselves. Some mirrors stretched their faces into grotesque masks of terror, while others showed them smiling eerily, their eyes hollow and lifeless. "Where the hell are we now?" Derek asked, his voice shaking. Lila turned slowly, her reflection staring back at her from every angle. But something was wrong. In one of the mirrors, her distorted reflection tilted its head and smiled, a movement she hadn't made. "Derek," she whispered, backing away. "The reflections, they're watching us." As if on cue, the distorted images began to move independently, stepping out of the mirrors one by one. They solidified as they emerged, becoming grotesque doppelgangers of Lila and Derek, their faces twisted into nightmarish grins. "We need to get out of here," Derek shouted, grabbing Lila's hand. The doppelgangers advanced, their grins widening as they moved closer. The real Lila and Derek turned and ran, their path winding through the maze of mirrors. Every turn brought more reflections to life, their laughter echoing through the room in a cacophony of madness. Lila's mind raced. This wasn't just a trap. It was a manifestation of the hotel's intent to break them. The sterile corridor had been a test, and now they were in its playground, hunted by versions of themselves that seemed to embody their darkest fears. "We can't keep running," she shouted, pulling Derek to a halt. "We need to find the source, like the heart." Derek hesitated, his breath ragged. "And if there's no source this time, then we make one," Lila said, her voice steely. The reflections closed in, their distorted laughter growing louder. Lila clutched Derek's hand tighter, ready to face whatever nightmare the hotel threw at them next. The distorted doppelgangers crowded in on them, their grotesque features grinning wider and wider as they moved closer. The mirrors, once quiet reflections, had transformed into nightmarish windows into twisted versions of reality. Each step Lila and Derek took to escape the reflections seemed futile. As the room appeared to expand endlessly, its mirrored walls multiplying the horrors around them. "We have to fight back," Derek said, his voice shaking but resolute. He grabbed a broken shard of glass from one of the mirrors, his hands trembling as he raised it toward the closest reflection. Lila shook her head. "That won't work. These things aren't real. They're just projections, like the hotel's way of testing us." Derek hesitated, his gaze flickering between the approaching doppelgangers. "So what? We wait for them to get us?" "No," Lila replied, her voice hardening with determination. "We need to take control. These reflections, they're us. If we can break the connection, break the illusion, maybe we can escape." She reached out, her fingers brushing against one of the mirrors. The surface rippled beneath her touch, like water disturbed by a stone. For a moment, she wondered if her idea was madness. But then, as her fingers made contact, something shifted. The reflection of her own face in the mirror seemed to flinch, an involuntary movement that sent a shiver down her spine. "You saw that, right?" she asked, her voice low. Derek nodded, eyes wide in disbelief. The reflection of her in the mirror had moved, but not in the way she had expected. Without warning, the doppelgangers surged forward, closing the distance. The reflection of Lila in the mirror distorted, growing taller and angrier as it stepped out, its movements jerky and unnatural. Derek swung his shard of glass at it, but it passed straight through, as if it were nothing more than smoke. The mirror flickered violently, as though the glass was losing its grip on reality. The reflection of Derek followed suit, its face twisting into a menacing smile before it lunged at him. He staggered back, narrowly avoiding the attack. "I don't think they're just reflections," Derek said, his breath coming faster. "They're parts of us, parts that we're not controlling. They're taking over." Lila's thoughts raced. She had always believed that the mind was the key to navigating fear. If you could control your own mind, you could control what you saw, what you feared. But these reflections seemed to be more than mere projections. They were manifestations of a deeper, darker part of themselves, a part that was being twisted and turned against them by the hotel's malevolent force. "Maybe the reflections aren't just showing our fears," Lila said slowly. "Maybe they're showing what we're capable of when we give in to the fear." Derek's eyes narrowed. "So, you're saying these things are us, but they're not the real us?" "Exactly," Lila replied. "They're the parts of us that we try to ignore. The anger, the regret, the guilt. This hotel is feeding off that. It's trying to pull us into its trap by making us face the worst parts of ourselves." Suddenly, one of the doppelgangers lunged at Lila, its hands reaching for her throat. She stumbled backward, her pulse hammering in her ears, but then something snapped. She looked into the reflection's cold, empty eyes and saw not a monster, but a version of herself. Weak, frightened, vulnerable. Lila's heart thundered. This wasn't a reflection of her. It was a version of herself that she had buried long ago, a version that was afraid of being consumed by the hotel's horrors. But she didn't have time to linger on that thought. She had to act. She closed her eyes for a moment, steadying herself, and then shouted, "Stop!" The words seemed to vibrate through the air, rippling the surface of the mirrors. The doppelgangers paused, their movements freezing mid-lunge. Lila opened her eyes to find that the reflection of herself in the mirror had stopped, frozen, caught in the very moment it had tried to take her. "Stop!" Lila repeated, more forcefully this time. She wasn't just commanding the reflections. She was commanding herself. Every ounce of her inner strength focused on rejecting the fear, rejecting the darkness that these reflections represented. And for a brief, fleeting moment, the doppelgangers seemed to shudder, their twisted smiles faltering as if they were uncertain of their own existence. Then, with a sudden explosion of energy, the reflection shattered. The mirrors cracked like glass breaking from the inside out, and the doppelgangers screamed, a deafening, terrifying sound that made the walls tremble. But instead of disappearing, they began to melt, their bodies dissolving into the air, leaving behind only the fractured, shimmering remains of the mirrors. Lila and Derek stood in stunned silence as the last echoes of the reflection's screams faded. The room had changed. The oppressive weight that had filled the air seemed to lift, and the mirrors no longer seemed to threaten them. But the destruction of the reflections had come at a cost. They now stood at the heart of the hotel's nightmare, closer than ever to the truth and the dangers that lurked just beneath the surface. Lila's hand trembled as she wiped sweat from her brow. "We didn't just face our fears," she whispered. "We destroyed them." Derek glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "I don't think that's enough," he said, his voice grim. "This place is still watching us." The room around them seemed to contract, as though it were listening, waiting for them to make their next move. The journey ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear. The deeper they delved into the hotel's madness, the more it seemed to expose and manipulate their deepest, darkest selves. The reflections may have been destroyed, but the war was far from over. The hotel was silent now, or perhaps it was merely quieter. The once deafening presence of the doppelgangers was gone, but Lila and Derek could still feel the weight of the building pressing down on them, its unseen eyes watching, waiting. The shattered remnants of the mirrors lay at their feet like discarded bones, and the air smelled faintly of burned paper, as though the very fabric of reality had been singed in their struggle. For a brief moment, the world seemed static, frozen in the aftermath of what they had just endured. But the silence, unnerving and thick, was not reassuring. It felt like the calm before a storm. Do you think we really destroyed them? Derek asked, his voice tentative, still struggling to make sense of what had just happened. He crouched down to pick up a shard of mirror from the ground, running his finger along its edge as if testing its authenticity. Lila didn't answer immediately. Instead, she surveyed the room, its walls, the dim lighting, the faint smell of mildew that clung to the corners. Despite the destruction, the hotel still felt alive. It had always been alive, in a way she hadn't fully comprehended until now. The mirrors, the reflections, the shadows, they were all part of its pulse, feeding off their deepest fears, their unspoken insecurities. I don't think we destroyed them, Lila said after a pause, her voice quiet but certain. I think we banished them. For now. Derek looked up, his brow furrowed in confusion. Banished? What do you mean? Lila took a deep breath, pushing her hair away from her face. The weight of her words felt heavy, but necessary. I think these reflections are just one layer of the hotel's manipulations. They're not the real threat, Derek. They're just manifestations of what we fear. The real danger is the hotel itself, how it's feeding off us, twisting our realities. These reflections might come back in another form. The thoughts settled like ice in her stomach. They hadn't won. They had merely bought themselves time. The hotel wasn't done with them. They both knew that. Derek stood up slowly, his hand still holding the shard of mirror. Then what do we do now? We can't just keep walking around and waiting for the next twisted version of ourselves to show up. We need answers, Lila, and we need to find them before this place consumes us completely. Lila nodded. She felt the same urgency, the same gnawing dread that had been building inside her since the moment they stepped into this hotel. They were no longer just guests in a place that promised luxury. They were intruders in a place that fed on human vulnerability, on human error. It wasn't a hotel. It was a trap, a labyrinth of their own minds and fears. She turned toward the corridor that stretched out before them, the dim light flickering as though it, too, was uncertain of its place. The walls seemed to breathe, pulsing with some unseen force. The hotel was alive, and they were its prey. We need to get to the source of all this, Lila said, her voice steadying as she forced herself to take a step forward. We need to find the heart of the hotel. That's where the answers are. We're not just fighting for our lives anymore, Derek. We're fighting to stop whatever this is from spreading beyond these walls. Derek hesitated for a moment before following her, his eyes scanning their surroundings with growing suspicion. And how do we even begin to find the heart of the hotel? This place is like a maze. Lila smiled grimly, the challenge not lost on her. I don't know yet, but I have a feeling that the hotel itself will show us the way. It's always been in control, hasn't it? Always manipulating us, bending us to its will. If we can just find a pattern, the key to unlocking this place, we might be able to stop it. As they moved deeper into the hotel, Lila couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them. Not just from the mirrors, but from the very walls. The silence was deafening, but beneath it was something more insidious, like the whisper of 1,000 unseen eyes tracking their every movement. She couldn't quite put her finger on it, but it was as if the hotel itself was waiting for them to make their next move. The hallway before them seemed to stretch out endlessly, twisting and turning in ways that didn't make sense. The architecture itself was a puzzle, a series of disconnected rooms, doors that led to nowhere, staircases that seemed to defy logic. There was no pattern to the layout, no sense of order. It was as if the hotel had been built with the intention of trapping its inhabitants in an infinite loop. But Lila refused to be deterred. We're close, she muttered under her breath, more to herself than to Derek. I can feel it. The hotel's trying to hide it, but we're getting closer. Derek wasn't so sure. The further they walked, the more unnerving it became. The walls, which had once seemed neutral, now appeared to ripple as though they were alive, shifting with every passing moment. The doors along the corridor were now all identical, their numbers worn away, as though they had been used so many times that they had lost their purpose. And then, as they reached what seemed to be another dead end, a door appeared, a door that had never been there before. The frame was old, cracked, its wood warped with age. But what struck them both was the sense of inevitability that washed over them as soon as they laid eyes on it. They hadn't chosen this door. The hotel had shown it to them. Lila stepped forward, hand outstretched. The door creaked open with a slow, almost reluctant motion, revealing nothing but a pitch-black room beyond. No light, no sound, just emptiness. And yet, Lila felt something calling to her from the darkness, a pull deep within her chest. It was as if the door were the key to everything they had been searching for. The answers lay beyond it, just beyond reach. She glanced back at Derek. "Are you ready?" His eyes met hers, and in that moment, she saw the fear in them, but also the same resolve. They had come this far. There was no turning back. With one final, decisive step, they crossed the threshold into the unknown. As Lila and Derek stepped through the threshold, the darkness enveloped them in a suffocating embrace. The air felt colder here, a sharp contrast to the humid atmosphere of the rest of the hotel. The light they had come to rely on, the flickering bulbs, the dim hallway sconces, vanished, leaving only the staleness of the void to guide their steps. They couldn't even hear their own breathing at first, the silence hanging so thick that it felt unnatural, as though the room itself had swallowed all sound. "Where are we?" Derek's voice broke the stillness, a whisper against the heavy silence. It felt almost sacrilegious, as if speaking too loudly might disturb the very fabric of this place. Lila didn't answer immediately. Her gaze shifted, trying to pierce the dark, but her eyes met only an endless, oppressive blackness. Yet, the silence was not complete. There was something faint, whispering just beyond her hearing. The unmistakable sensation of being watched crept into her mind once again. It wasn't just the hotel now. This room felt different, older, heavier. The space seemed to press in on them, refusing to allow their presence to go unnoticed. "This place feels wrong," Derek added, more to himself than to her, his voice tinged with unease. "Like it's not just a room, but a memory." Lila nodded slowly, her fingers grazing the walls in an attempt to anchor herself in the moment. It felt as though they were walking through a forgotten fragment of the hotel's past, some forgotten corner of history that had been locked away for reasons unknown. But it wasn't just the walls that seemed ancient. The very air had the scent of decay, like something long abandoned had been unearthed after years of neglect. The longer they stood in the dark, the more vivid the sense of disorientation became. The room stretched and contracted with every breath they took. Each step they took seemed to shift the very nature of the space. It was as though the room itself was changing in real time, reshaping its boundaries. What had initially appeared to be a simple, small space now seemed vast, infinite, as if the dimensions of the room were no longer defined by anything as mundane as walls or floors. Then, without warning, the silence broke. A soft, indistinct hum began to vibrate from somewhere deep within the room, a low frequency that Lila felt in her chest before she heard it. It was like a heartbeat, slow and deliberate, emanating from the very floor beneath them. The sound was almost imperceptible at first, but it grew louder, the room pulsing with an energy she couldn't explain. "Do you hear that?" Derek whispered, his face pale, his hand gripping Lila's arm. Lila nodded, but she couldn't respond. The hum grew louder, becoming more insistent. The walls, if they could even be called walls now, seemed to ripple with the sound, like water disturbed by an unseen force. And then, through the darkness, something began to form. It was at first a mere distortion, a slight shift in the air, but as it solidified, it became clear. A figure, half-formed, drifting like smoke through the room. The shape was humanoid but not quite human. It flickered and wavered, as if it couldn't decide whether it was fully corporeal or just a figment of the imagination. Lila's heart raced, and for a brief moment, she was unsure whether she was seeing this thing with her eyes or feeling it with her mind. It was both. The room, it seemed, was alive, feeding on their fear, molding itself around their perceptions. And then it spoke. "You shouldn't be here." The voice was soft, almost soothing, but it carried an undeniable authority. one that made Lila's blood run cold. The sound echoed through the room, bouncing off the shifting walls, reverberating in a way that made it impossible to tell where it came from. The figure seemed to grow more solid, more real with each word it spoke. As it approached them, Lila felt an overwhelming compulsion to run, to flee from whatever this was. But her feet were rooted to the floor, her body frozen in place. "Who are you?" Derek asked, his voice trembling as he took a step back, still clutching the shard of mirror from earlier, though it now seemed a feeble weapon against this thing. The figure paused as if considering the question. Its form seemed to stabilize for a moment, taking on the shape of a woman, her face pale and expressionless. She was dressed in the same ornate hotel uniform as the staff, but there was something wrong about her, a coldness that radiated from her every movement. "Who I was is of no consequence," the figure replied. "What matters is what you seek, and what you seek is not what you will find here." Lila swallowed hard, her mind racing. "We're trying to leave. We want to know what's happening here. Why this hotel? Why everything is like this?" The figure's lips curled into something that might have been a smile, though it was devoid of warmth. "You cannot leave. You're already part of it." The words hung in the air like a sentence, each syllable a weight pressing down on them. Part of it? What did that mean? Lila exchanged a quick glance with Derek, who looked as confused and terrified as she felt. Before she could ask more, the figure began to disintegrate. The edges of her form blurred and frayed, dissipating into the air like mist. In an instant, she was gone, leaving only the faint hum of the room and the oppressive silence in her wake. Lila's heart pounded in her chest, the blood rushing in her ears as the weight of the encounter settled in. They had just spoken to someone who seemed to know more about the hotel than they ever could. And yet, the words didn't make sense. How could they be part of it? Were they victims? Or had they become something more, something unrecognizable, altered by the hotel in ways they couldn't comprehend? As the last remnants of the figure's presence faded, the darkness around them began to shift again. The walls no longer felt like walls. They had become a mirror, reflecting not only their images but something deeper, something real. The room had become a reflection of their innermost fears, their uncertainties. It was as if the hotel had been waiting for them to unlock its deepest secret, and they had just crossed a threshold they could never undo. "Lila, what is this place?" Derek's voice was hoarse, filled with fear and confusion. "I don't know," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "But I think we're about to find out." In the wake of their encounter with the mysterious figure, Lila and Derek stood in the dark, feeling the oppressive weight of the hotel bearing down on them more than ever. The room, once merely strange and unsettling, now seemed to pulse with an undeniable energy, as if it were alive, breathing, watching, and waiting. Each second that passed in the dim light felt like an eternity. The silence was thick, almost tangible, and yet it was filled with 100 questions they could not yet answer. "What the hell was that?" Derek finally whispered, his voice shaking. His wide eyes were filled with confusion and fear, though it was clear that the encounter had shattered any semblance of the calm, collected exterior he had maintained until now. Lila didn't have an answer. She stood frozen, her gaze fixed on the now empty space where the figure had stood only moments before. The room seemed to be shrinking around them, and the shadows, thick, almost sentient, twisted in unnatural ways. The air felt dense, like the weight of history itself pressed down upon them. It was clear now that the hotel was no ordinary place. This was not just a building. It was a labyrinth of memories, of echoes from the past, alive with its own twisted consciousness. "What do you think she meant? You're already part of it," Derek asked, his voice quieter now, more reflective. Lila swallowed hard. "I don't know. But whatever this place is, it's not just some haunted hotel. It's something else. Something we don't understand." She turned away from the spot where the figure had disappeared, instinctively stepping toward the exit. But as she did, the door they had entered through began to distort. The once straight lines of the frame rippled like water, warping and bending, before it dissolved into the wall, leaving no trace of its existence. Lila's heart skipped a beat. They were trapped. A wave of panic surged through her chest. "We need to get out of here, Derek. Now." But Derek remained still. His eyes narrowed as he looked around the room. "Where's the way out?" he asked, his voice taut with tension. "Everything is changing. The whole place is." He was interrupted by a low, guttural sound that seemed to emanate from the very walls themselves. It was a deep, vibrating hum, the same frequency they had heard earlier, but now louder, more insistent. It reverberated through their bones, shaking them to the core. Before Lila could respond, a door appeared, seemingly out of nowhere. It was small, unassuming, its wooden frame cracked and weathered with age. There was no indication that it had been there moments before, yet it stood before them, inviting them in. The hotel had always been strange, but this was beyond anything they had encountered so far. It felt as though the building itself was offering them a choice. Derek's eyes locked onto the door. He stepped forward, his hand reaching for the tarnished brass knob. "Should we?" he asked, his voice low, uncertain. Lila hesitated. She wanted to run, to leave the hotel and never look back. But a part of her, a deep, instinctual part, knew they had no choice but to go forward. They had crossed a point of no return. "We have to. There's no way out until we understand what's happening here." The door creaked open, its hinges groaning in protest. Beyond it lay a staircase, dark and spiraling downward into what seemed like an endless abyss. The air was thick with a stench that made Lila's stomach turn, a mix of mildew and decay, like a place that had been abandoned for years. There was no light, no sign of life, only the heavy darkness that seemed to stretch downward, swallowing everything in its path. "What is this place?" Derek muttered, his words almost lost in the thick, suffocating silence. "I don't know," Lila said, her voice trembling. "But I'm starting to think we're in something much worse than a haunted hotel. It's like we're part of its story now. We become a part of whatever this place is, and there's no way out unless we figure out why." They descended the stairs cautiously, each step creaking beneath their weight, sending small echoes through the cavernous space. The deeper they went, the more the air seemed to thicken, the darkness pressing in from all sides. Lila's mind raced as she tried to make sense of what was happening. What was it that the figure had meant? You're already part of it. Had they been marked? Was this all part of some twisted game? Or had they unwittingly crossed into a different realm altogether? As they reached the bottom of the staircase, they found themselves standing in a large, circular room. The walls were adorned with intricate tapestries depicting scenes that were disturbingly familiar. Scenes from their own lives, distorted and twisted, like a nightmare version of their memories. They looked around in disbelief. How was this possible? How could the hotel know things about them that even they had forgotten? This isn't real," Derek muttered, his voice shaking. "These are our lives. This place is showing us our lives, but twisted. It knows us." Lila felt a chill run down her spine. "It's more than that. It's like the hotel is feeding on us, using our memories against us." But before she could say anything else, a sound cut through the air, sharp and sudden. A low growl, followed by a deafening screech. Lila turned instinctively toward the noise, but there was nothing. The room had shifted again, and they were no longer alone. Shapes began to emerge from the shadows. Figures, tall and indistinct, their features flickering in and out of focus, like the remnants of a bad dream. They moved toward Lila and Derek with deliberate slowness, their forms indistinguishable from the darkness itself. And then, as if to confirm their worst fears, one of the figures spoke. "You've come too far." The voice was deep and hollow, echoing in the chamber like a death knell. "There's no turning back now." Lila's heart thudded in her chest as she realized the truth. They were no longer merely guests in the hotel. They were part of its history, part of its story. And as much as they might try to escape, they would never be free from its grasp. The price of truth was steep, and they had already paid it. The air was suffocating in the strange, circular room, the thick darkness pressing down from every direction. Lila and Derek stood frozen, their eyes locked onto the flickering figures emerging from the shadows. The growl, the screech, the words, their minds were reeling, trying to make sense of it all. What did it mean that they were now part of the hotel story? Was this some kind of twisted dream? Or had they crossed into a reality where time and memory no longer held meaning? As the figures advanced, they became clearer, their outlines sharpening. Their faces were obscured, but their presence was overwhelming, like specters who had lingered too long in the world of the living. The air felt charged with a malevolent energy, and every instinct in Lila screamed that they needed to leave, but the exit seemed further away with each passing moment. The room itself seemed to close in on them, the walls pulsing with an unsettling rhythm, as if they were alive. One of the figures stepped forward, its movement slow and deliberate. Lila could hear the echo of each footstep, the soft scrape against the stone floor, but it wasn't just sound. It felt like the steps reverberated deep within her chest. The figure's voice was a whisper, barely audible, but it carried a weight of inevitability. "You don't remember, do you?" Lila's heart skipped a beat, and she turned toward Derek, her eyes wide. He looked equally shaken. What did the figure mean? Remember what? Lila's voice trembled with the question, but the figure remained silent for a moment before continuing. "The hotel. It's been here for centuries," the figure continued, its voice carrying the gravity of an ancient truth. "It feeds on memories, on the ones who walk through its doors. You think you're the first to arrive, but no. This place is always drawn in those who have something to lose. And you, both of you, you've already given it what it wants." Lila shook her head, her thoughts spiraling. "No, that's impossible. We haven't given it anything." The words felt hollow as she spoke them, even to herself. How could they have given anything to the hotel? They had barely been here for a day, yet the events had unfolded with a speed and certainty that made no sense. The figure took another step forward, its presence looming larger. "You've been marked," it said, each word dripping with malice. "From the moment you entered, you were part of the cycle. The hotel doesn't just let anyone in, it chooses. And now, there's no way out." Lila's pulse quickened. Marked? Part of the cycle? The hotel had chosen them? The thought was incomprehensible. It was as though the figure was speaking in riddles, each word casting more doubt in her mind. How had they become part of this? What was the hotel's endgame? Derek's voice cut through the tension. "What do you want from us?" he demanded, his voice filled with both fear and defiance. Lila could see his fists clenched at his sides, his knuckles white, but there was no answer. The figure simply stared at them, its face still hidden in shadow, as if waiting for something. "I'm not the one who decides," the figure said, its voice growing softer, almost as if it was receding into the distance. "The hotel will show you what you need to know, but it won't be kind." The figure began to dissolve, its shape blurring and fading into the darkness. The room seemed to shift once again, as if reality itself were bending and twisting to accommodate some new, hidden truth. The tension in the air thickened, and the ground beneath Lila's feet felt unstable, like the foundation was slipping away. Lila stumbled back, her thoughts in turmoil. What does that mean? What does the hotel want from us?" The question hung in the air, unanswered, as she looked around, hoping to find some clue, some sign of what to do next. But the more she searched, the more the room seemed to mock her efforts. There was no escape, no way out. Derek reached for her arm, his grip tight. "We can't stay here," he said urgently. "We need to find a way out. We need to leave this place before it consumes us." Lila nodded, but even as she did, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were being led somewhere the hotel had already decided. The shadows in the room seemed to stretch longer, twisting as if alive, and the once clear path ahead now seemed more like an endless maze. They weren't in control. Not anymore. The figures were gone, but their words lingered in the air like a toxic fog. The hotel was watching them, waiting for them to make the next move. And in that moment, Lila realized that the true horror of the hotel wasn't the physical dangers, the strange occurrences, or even the twisted memories. It was the fact that they had entered into something that had already been written. The hotel was a living, breathing entity, and their story had already been chosen. There was no going back. As they walked forward, Unsure of what lay ahead, the door to the next room creaked open by itself. Whatever awaited them beyond it, they had no choice but to face it. The cycle had begun, and they were trapped within it, as helpless as the countless others before them. Lila's heart raced as the door creaked open, the sound of its ancient hinges groaning in protest as though they, too, resented the intrusion. She hesitated, a gnawing sense of dread anchoring her feet to the spot. The darkness beyond the door seemed endless, a void waiting to swallow them whole. But there was no other choice. They had to move forward, even if it meant walking deeper into the heart of the hotel's mystery. Derek's grip on her arm tightened, his fingers cold against her skin, and for a moment, Lila allowed herself to lean on him. It wasn't much, but it was something. As they crossed the threshold, the air shifted, heavy, thick with the kind of silence that was almost oppressive. There was no sound of wind, no distant hum of the building's ancient machinery. It was as if they had stepped into a space where time itself had forgotten to exist. The room was unlike any they had encountered before. The walls were lined with mirrors, each one reflecting an image of the two of them, but distorted, warped. The reflections didn't match their movements. They lingered a moment longer, or shifted in strange, jerking motions, as though the glass itself was struggling to understand what was real. Lila shuddered at the sight, and even Derek seemed unsettled. "What is this place?" he muttered under his breath, but Lila didn't have an answer. The floor beneath their feet seemed to breathe, rising and falling like the slow, deliberate pulse of some ancient beast. Every step they took felt like it was being watched, and not by the mirrors. They were not reflections but eyes, observing them with a hunger they couldn't understand. It was as if the room itself was alive, aware of their presence. Lila swallowed hard, trying to ignore the unsettling sensation that there was something just behind her, lurking in the shadows. As they walked deeper into the room, the mirrors began to change. At first, they only distorted, bending the reflection into odd shapes. But then, slowly, the figures in the mirrors began to move independently of them. The faces staring back at them no longer mirrored their own, but instead contorted into strange, twisted versions, withered, gaunt, and empty-eyed. Lila felt her breath catch in her throat as one of the reflections stepped out of the mirror entirely, crossing the room toward them with slow, deliberate steps. The figure was a woman, her face a pale mask of decayed beauty. She wore an old-fashioned gown, the fabric tattered and torn, her hair falling in ragged strands. Her eyes, though, were the most unsettling part. They were wide, vacant, devoid of recognition. Lila froze, the words from the previous figure echoing in her mind. "You've already given it what it wants. What had they given the hotel? What was this place?" The woman spoke, her voice a rasping whisper, barely audible, as though it had been torn from the depths of some forgotten time. "You are closer than you think." The words sent a chill down Lila's spine, as if the very room had become a living nightmare, one that was closing in around them. "Closer to what?" Derek demanded, his voice shaky but still firm. "What do you want from us?" The figure didn't answer directly. Instead, her reflection began to move, her arms reaching toward them with a grotesque fluidity, as though she were pulling them into the mirrors. The movement was unnatural, too quick, and Lila's heart pounded in her chest. She took a step back, but the room stretched impossibly wide, pushing them closer to the mirrors and the woman who now seemed to tower over them. "Everything here is part of the story," the woman finally whispered, the words hanging in the air like a curse. "The hotel will take from you, as it has taken from so many before." The reflection of her began to split, one after another, until there were countless versions of the woman, each more distorted than the last, all reaching out toward them. Lila grabbed Derek's arm, panic rising in her chest. She knew they couldn't stay here. They couldn't let the hotel claim them, take them into its twisted fold. "We need to leave, Derek. Now." But Derek was transfixed, his eyes locked onto the ever-multiplying figures. "What do you mean, part of the story? What does it want?" he asked, as if the woman would answer him, as if there was any explanation to the madness surrounding them. Suddenly, the mirrors began to pulse. each beat sending ripples through the room like a wave crashing against the shore. Lila's vision blurred as the reflections shifted once more, warping and contorting, until she couldn't tell which was real. The air grew thick, suffocating, and she could feel the weight of something ancient and unstoppable closing in around them. With a sudden, violent crash, one of the mirrors shattered, the glass scattering across the floor like jagged shards of time itself. The woman's figure dissolved into the glass, her voice echoing in their minds. There is no escape. The path has been set. Lila grabbed Derek's hand and yanked him toward the now wide gap in the mirror. The room had become a labyrinth of shifting reflections and oppressive shadows, but they had no choice but to press forward. Whatever the hotel was, whatever it had become, it wasn't going to let them go. Not without a price. As they moved toward the opening, the whispers around them grew louder, voices overlapping, drowning out their thoughts. The sound became deafening, and for a moment, Lila feared she would lose herself in the noise. But then suddenly everything stopped. The room fell silent, and a new door appeared, one that hadn't been there before. It beckoned them forward. It was the only way out. Lila knew that they were being drawn deeper into the hotel's twisted web, but there was no turning back. Every path forward seemed to lead further into the darkness, but staying here, in the room of mirrors, meant certain destruction. So they took a breath and stepped through the door, not knowing where it would lead, only that the story had just begun. The door closed behind them with a soft click, sealing them off from the labyrinth of mirrors and whispers they had just escaped. Lila's heart was still pounding, each beat loud in her ears, as if it might break through the fragile calm of the new room they had entered. The silence here felt unnatural, a vacuum that made her wonder if it, too, was holding its breath. She could feel the weight of Derek's hand in hers, but it was the only real thing in this place, and even that seemed to blur at the edges, as if it too was part of the illusion. The room they had stepped into was small, almost claustrophobic, with walls that seemed to stretch upwards impossibly high, their color a dull, sickly gray. There were no windows, no obvious exits, just a dim light flickering overhead. The air smelled stale, like something old and forgotten, a place that had been left behind for years without a second thought. There was a feeling, too, of being watched. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but Lila could sense it in the way her skin prickled, in the heaviness of the silence. It was as though the room itself had its own consciousness, one that was very much aware of their presence. Lila could hear Derek's breath beside her, shallow and uneven, but when she turned to look at him, his eyes were vacant, unfocused. Something was wrong. He had been present, engaged, even scared, but now he seemed almost distant, as if part of him had been left behind in the mirrors. She shook his shoulder gently, her voice soft but firm. "Derek, are you okay?" He blinked rapidly, his focus snapping back to her with a suddenness that startled her. "Yeah, I'm fine." But there was something in his voice, an undertone of something unspoken, a hint of fear she hadn't heard before. I don't know. I thought I saw something, a figure in the corner, just outside the light." Lila turned instinctively toward the shadowed corner where he had pointed, but there was nothing there. The room was empty, save for the two of them, and yet the air felt heavier now, as if the very space around them had deepened. The flickering light overhead seemed to pulse in rhythm with her heartbeat, creating an eerie sense of time slipping away. "No," she said firmly, "it's just your mind playing tricks on you. The hotel is messing with us. We got to stay focused." But even as she spoke, she felt it, a presence, indistinct, elusive, but there. The room seemed to grow colder, and the flickering light above them dimmed even further, as though it, too, was retreating from something unseen. The silence stretched out longer than it should have, and Lila realized with a growing sense of dread that she hadn't heard the whispering voices in a while. The absence of sound was almost worse than the noise. It was like a pause in the rhythm of the hotel, a deep breath before the next horrible exhale. A sudden creaking noise shattered the stillness, the sound of something heavy shifting behind one of the walls. Lila spun around, her senses on high alert. There, in the farthest corner of the room, A door had materialized where none had been before. It was an old-fashioned door, wooden and weathered, with brass handles that gleamed dully in the faint light. It hadn't been there a moment ago. She was sure of it. "Do you see that?" Derek asked, his voice barely above a whisper, though his tone held a strange urgency now. Lila nodded. She had seen it. She wasn't imagining it. "We have to go through it. It's the only way out." The door loomed before them, as if it had always been there, a fixture of the room that had been hidden from their sight until now. Its presence felt deliberate, like the hotel was giving them a new path to walk, one it had chosen for them. The idea of being led by the hotel felt wrong, but it was the only option. If they didn't go through it, what would happen? The suffocating silence? The shadows that seemed to shift with a mind of their own? Or worse, would the room itself begin to swallow them whole? As Lila reached for the doorknob, the air around them thickened. The temperature dropped, and she could see her breath fogging in front of her, a sign that the room was alive in ways they didn't understand. She hesitated, one last flicker of doubt running through her. Was it truly safe to open this new door? Could they trust what lay beyond it? But Derek was already pushing it open, his hand trembling as he turned the knob. The door creaked, the sound more than just an echo. It was like a cry from the very walls themselves, as if the hotel was protesting their movement, unwilling to let them leave. Still, Derek opened the door wide, and beyond it lay another room, darker than the one they had just left. They stepped into the new space, the door shutting behind them with an unnerving finality. The new room was smaller than the previous one, with walls that seemed to close in on them. The floor was covered in thick dust, untouched, as though no one had stepped there in years. It was a strange sensation. This room, unlike all the others, felt almost familiar, as though they had been here before. In the center of the room stood an ornate, full-length mirror, its frame gold and intricate, glimmering faintly in the dim light. Lila felt a chill run down her spine. She had seen mirrors before, but this one, it was different. It didn't reflect her and Derek's image at first. Instead, it reflected a scene, a room, a different room, one that seemed impossibly far away. The image was distorted, but it was unmistakable. Lila leaned closer, drawn to the mirror despite the unease pooling in her stomach. As she looked at the reflection, she realized with a shock that the room in the mirror was not the one they had just entered, but the one they had left behind. The mirror room, with its warped figures and twisting faces. Her breath caught in her throat as she backed away. "It's happening again," she whispered, but Derek's eyes were wide as he stared into the glass. The reflection in the mirror wasn't just showing the room they had escaped from, it was showing them, right there in the room with the mirror. Lila watched, horrified, as the reflections of her and Derek smiled back at them. But the smiles weren't theirs. They were wide, distorted, cruel. And then, from the depths of the reflection, a figure emerged. The woman from the mirrors, the one they had seen earlier. She stepped out of the glass, her eyes fixed on them as she stretched her hand toward them. "We can't escape," Derek murmured, his voice filled with despair. "We're trapped." And for the first time since entering the hotel, Lila felt the full weight of that truth pressing down on her. They had been part of the hotel's twisted narrative all along. There was no way out. Not anymore. The air in the room seemed to thicken as the figure in the mirror moved closer, her presence radiating a quiet malevolence. Lila felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand up, her heart pounding as if it was attempting to break free from her chest. The woman's reflection was no longer confined to the glass. She was stepping through it, her movements slow and deliberate. Her eyes locked onto Lila and Derek. And for the first time since entering the hotel, Lila felt a chilling certainty that whatever force governed this place was far beyond anything they could comprehend. Derek stood frozen beside her, his body rigid, as though he couldn't tear his gaze away from the reflection of the woman that was now stepping toward them. There was no doubt in Lila's mind that this was the same figure who had haunted the mirrors earlier, the one whose voice had whispered fragments of forgotten memories. The woman's features were unervingly familiar, but Lila couldn't place her. It was as if she were seeing a distorted version of herself reflected back at her, twisted by some unseen force. The mirror itself seemed to ripple, distorting as the woman stepped further out, until her form solidified in the room. The soft clicking of her heels against the wooden floor echoed in the silence, a sound that sent a shiver down Lila's spine. The figure's eyes never left them, her lips curling into a smile that wasn't quite right. It was too wide, too knowing, as though she had seen their every move before they made it. "We've been waiting for you," the woman said, her voice soft but piercing, like it was coming from all directions at once. Lila's skin crawled at the words. There was no warmth in her tone, just an emptiness that filled the room. The woman's smile widened even more, and Lila had the unnerving sense that the woman was reading their thoughts, their every fear laid bare before her. Derek took a hesitant step back, his voice barely audible. "Who are you?" The woman's smile faltered for just a moment, her eyes flashing with a cold, calculating gleam. "I am your reflection, and I am the game you're playing." She stepped closer to them, and with each movement, Lila felt the temperature drop even further. The air was now thick with tension, and every breath she took felt like a struggle against the oppressive atmosphere that seemed to close in on them. Lila clenched her fists, trying to steady herself, but her mind raced with questions she couldn't answer. What did the woman mean by the game? What was she trying to tell them? And why did it feel like the hotel itself was watching them, pulling their strings like marionettes in a twisted play? "The game is simple," the woman continued, her voice growing almost musical in its eerie cadence. "You play or you perish. Escape is not an option. It never was." Lila shook her head, her mind reeling. "Escape? We've been trying to escape since we got here. You're part of this place, aren't you?" The woman's smile returned, this time colder, more sinister. "I am its keeper. The hotel is my domain, and you are but pieces on the board. The rooms, the reflections, they all serve a purpose. You cannot outrun your fate here." Derek's breath caught in his throat, his voice barely a whisper. "So this is all some sort of trap?" The woman's eyes gleamed with a terrifying amusement. "Not a trap. A game. A test. You must prove you're worthy of leaving. And if you fail," she trailed off, letting the silence fill the space between them. Lila felt her stomach twist at the thought. What kind of test was this? And why were they the ones chosen to play it? They had no control here, no power over the twisted rules of the hotel. She wanted to fight, to scream, to demand answers, but the words stuck in her throat. The weight of their situation was suffocating, and for a brief moment, she felt completely powerless, trapped in a nightmare that stretched endlessly before her. The woman took another step forward, and the room seemed to shrink even further, the walls pressing in like a vice. "You will play my game, whether you want or not. There are no choices here, only consequences." Lila's mind raced, trying to find a way out, a way to turn the tide. But as her eyes met Derek's, she saw the same fear reflected in his expression. The mirror had already shown them that they were doomed to repeat this cycle. There was no way forward, no way back. They were trapped in this nightmarish world, and the woman in front of them was the architect of their suffering. "Let's get this over with," Lila said, her voice shaky but determined. She didn't know what she was agreeing to, but it felt like surrendering was the only option. If they didn't play the game, they would never leave. They had to survive, to find a way through this madness. The woman's smile softened, as though she had been waiting for them to come to this conclusion. "Good. You're learning," she said, her voice dripping with a twisted satisfaction. "But remember, the game always changes. You'll never know what's next until it's too late." As the woman took another step toward them, Lila's mind spun with possibilities. What kind of game was she talking about? Was it physical, mental, or something far worse? The uncertainty gnawed at her. But one thing was clear. Whatever they were about to face would push them beyond their limits. There was no escaping this hotel, no way to outrun the twisted reflection of themselves that it had created. The woman stopped just inches from them, her presence overwhelming, and she gestured toward the door that had appeared in the corner of the room. "This is your first challenge. Walk through that door. You'll find out what awaits you on the other side." Lila's eyes flickered to the door, her heart racing as she considered the choice before them. She could feel the weight of it pressing down on her. Once they passed through that door, there would be no turning back. The game would begin in earnest, and they would have no choice but to follow the rules set by the hotel's cruel keeper. Lila swallowed hard, her throat dry, and nodded. There was no other choice. They had to keep moving forward, even if they had no idea what awaited them on the other side. The game was in motion, and they were nothing more than pieces on a board. As Lila and Derek stepped through the door, they found themselves in a long, dimly lit corridor. The walls were lined with old, tarnished mirrors, each reflecting their images in a distorted, surreal way. The floor was covered in a rich, red carpet that seemed to stretch endlessly ahead, swallowing up the light from the flickering bulbs above. It was eerily silent, except for the soft echo of their footsteps, which seemed to reverberate down the corridor, louder than they should have been. The air felt thick with the weight of expectation, as though the very walls were watching, waiting for something to happen. Lila's heart pounded in her chest. She had no idea what they were about to face. Every instinct screamed at her to turn back, to flee, but she knew that was impossible. The woman in the reflection had made it clear. There was no way out, no escape, no choice but to play the game. She glanced over at Derek, who was walking beside her, his face pale and drawn. His eyes darted nervously between the mirrors, as though expecting them to come to life at any moment. The deeper they ventured into the corridor, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The mirrors grew larger, their surfaces polished to a mirror-like sheen that seemed to reflect not only their bodies but something deeper, something they couldn't quite place. Lila felt a creeping unease building in the pit of her stomach. The reflections didn't just show their physical forms. They seemed to warp their features, twisting their expressions into grotesque parodies of themselves. "It's like they're alive," Derek whispered, his voice tight with fear. Lila could hear the tremor in his words, and she could feel it too, an undeniable presence lurking just behind the glass, waiting to make its move. They reached the end of the corridor, where a heavy wooden door stood. Its surface was marked with strange symbols, etched into the wood with a precision that seemed almost unnatural. The door was slightly ajar, as though inviting them inside, but Lila couldn't shake the feeling that whatever lay behind it was something far worse than anything they had encountered so far. "I don't know if I can do this," Derek muttered, his voice low. He had stopped walking, his hand hovering near the door, but not quite touching it. "This place, it's not just a hotel. It's like it's alive, feeding off our fear." Lila felt the weight of his words, but she knew there was no other choice. They had come this far, and there was no turning back now. She reached out and pushed the door open, the creak of the hinges echoing in the otherwise silent hallway. Beyond the door, a small, dimly lit room awaited them. Inside, there were no windows, only walls lined with more mirrors. The air was thick with the scent of something musty and old, like forgotten memories. As Lila stepped into the room, she felt a coldness wash over her, and for a moment, the room seemed to spin, the reflections warping and shifting. Her vision blurred, and she felt as though she were caught in a nightmare, unsure of what was real and what was an illusion. Derek stumbled in behind her, his breath shallow. "This place, it's not real. None of it is real." Lila didn't respond immediately. Instead, she focused on the mirrors. In one of them, she saw something that made her blood run cold, a reflection of herself, but not the woman standing in front of the mirror. This version of her was older, her face hollowed and gaunt, her eyes empty pits of despair. The reflection smiled at her in a way that wasn't friendly, a smile that sent chills through her entire body. "Look at yourself, Lila," the reflection in the mirror spoke, its voice soft but tinged with a sinister undertone. "You think you're different? That you can escape? You're just like all the others who came before you." Lila's breath hitched, and she backed away from the mirror, her heart racing. "This isn't real. This is just part of the game," she whispered to herself, trying to convince herself that it was nothing more than a trick. But deep down, a part of her feared that the reflection was telling the truth, that she was no different from everyone else who had come before her, trapped in an endless cycle of torment. Derek stepped forward, his voice shaking. "We have to get out of here. This place is messing with our heads." But as he spoke, something in the room shifted. The walls seemed to close in around them, and the mirrors began to pulse with a strange energy. The reflections of Lila and Derek started to move on their own, their movements jerky and unnatural. In one mirror, Derek was reaching out toward Lila, his face contorted with an expression of horror, as if trying to warn her of something unseen. In another, Lila was running, her feet barely touching the ground, as though she were fleeing from something that was chasing her. Then, as if triggered by their fear, the mirrors began to speak in unison, their voices melding into one. "You can't leave. You belong here. Forever." The words echoed in Lila's mind, drowning out all other thoughts. Her pulse quickened, and she felt a suffocating panic rising within her chest. The walls felt like they were pressing in on her, the mirrors reflecting every part of her psyche, every doubt and fear she had ever tried to bury. It was as though the hotel had become a living entity, feeding off their emotions, using their own reflections against them. But even in the face of this overwhelming terror, something inside Lila refused to break. She had come this far, and she wasn't going to let the hotel or the game win. She took a deep breath and forced herself to focus. There had to be a way out. The reflections were just illusions, tricks of the mind designed to break them. She wasn't going to let herself be consumed by it. Derek's voice broke through her thoughts. "Lila, we need to get out of here. Now." With a sense of grim determination, Lila turned to face him. "We will. But first, we need to face this. We need to find the truth behind all of this." As she spoke, she felt a surge of strength within herself. She wasn't going to let the hotel dictate her fate. The game was far from over, and it was time to take control of it, before it consumed them both. Lila's determination burned brighter than ever as she and Derek stood within the mirrored room. The relentless voices from the mirrors, a distorted chorus chanting that they would never escape, still echoed in her ears. They had come so far, yet the truth was elusive, tangled in webs of illusion and manipulation. She could feel the hotel's pulse, its beating rhythm resonating beneath her feet, as if the very foundation of the building was alive. But something in her refused to accept this twisted reality. She had to understand the nature of the hotel, its origins, and what it wanted from them. "We need to find the source," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor of fear that still gripped her heart. Derek glanced at her, his eyes wide with doubt, but he didn't protest. He knew that there was no other way forward. The mirrors were more than just reflections. They were a window into the hotel's malicious soul. The hotel had been feeding off their fear, twisting their perceptions, but Lila was starting to see through the veil. As they stepped away from the mirrors, the room began to shift again, subtly at first, then more dramatically. The walls seemed to stretch, the ceiling rising impossibly high. The carpet beneath their feet felt spongy, like it was shifting with every step they took. The sense of disorientation was overwhelming, and Lila felt her grip on reality start to slip. But she refused to falter. She had come this far, and now she could feel the presence of something hidden, something far worse than the game they had been playing. Derek stumbled beside her, his gaze darting between the shifting room and the dark hallway beyond. "What is this place, Lila?" His voice was hollow, a reflection of the panic that had taken root in his heart. She didn't have an answer for him. Not yet. But she did know one thing. The hotel was not just a place of torment. It was a trap, a mechanism designed to ensnare souls and feed off their deepest fears. And they had been walking into it step by step. The corridor in front of them stretched into shadow, a far-reaching darkness that seemed to beckon them toward an unknown end. Lila's fingers brushed against the wall, and for a split second, the surface of the wallpaper seemed to ripple, like a pool of water disturbed by an unseen hand. Beneath her fingers, she could feel a pulse, soft, slow, like a heartbeat. A chill ran through her as the realization hit her. The hotel was more than just a structure. It was sentient. It had a mind of its own, a force that sought to control them, to consume their very essence. Without thinking, Lila grabbed Derek's hand and began walking toward the dark expanse, every instinct telling her that the heart of the hotel lay ahead. The further they moved into the darkness, the more the air thickened. It was oppressive, laden with the stench of mildew and decay. The walls around them seemed to close in, as if narrowing their path. The floor beneath their feet began to creak, sending vibrations through their bodies. Every step felt like a test, a challenge to their resolve. Lila, Derek's voice cracked, but she didn't stop. She knew that if they hesitated now, they might never find their way out. The hotel was alive, and it would twist their perceptions further if they allowed it. She focused on the pull in her gut, that feeling that the center of the hotel was near, that they were getting closer to understanding the truth. They reached a door, old and weathered. It would darken with time. The door handle was cold to the touch, a stark contrast to the warmth of their bodies. Lila hesitated for only a moment before pushing it open. It creaked loudly, as if protesting their intrusion. What lay beyond the door was not a room, but a vast chamber that seemed to stretch beyond the limits of the building. The space was empty, save for a single chair placed in the center. It was simple, made of dark wood, but there was something deeply unsettling about it, as though it were meant for someone or something to sit in judgment. The chair seemed to call to them, its presence undeniable. But as Lila and Derek moved toward it, the air around them thickened with an unnatural energy. The room shifted, and for the first time, they realized they were not alone. Figures appeared in the shadows, their forms indistinct but menacing. Lila's heart skipped a beat as she recognized them. The lost souls, the previous victims of the hotel. Their faces were blank slates, their eyes hollow, their bodies contorted as though they had been twisted by the very walls of the hotel. They were trapped, bound to the hotel by the same force that had ensnared Lila and Derek. "We're not the first," Lila whispered, dread creeping into her voice. "This has happened before." The realization hit her like a wave. The hotel didn't just trap them. It consumed their very essence, using them to fuel its existence. The figures in the shadows were not ghosts. They were reflections of those who had tried and failed to escape. Their souls were bound to the hotel, forever serving as a reminder of the hotel's insatiable hunger. The chair at the center of the room began to vibrate, sending a jolt of fear through Lila. It was no longer just a piece of furniture. It was the heart of the hotel, the source of its power. And now it was calling to her. "We have to destroy it," Lila said, her voice barely audible over the rising hum of energy. But even as she spoke, she knew the truth. This was no ordinary chair. It was a conduit, a channel through which the hotel's power flowed. It would not be destroyed easily. Derek's face twisted with fear, but there was something else there, something she hadn't seen before: determination. They had come this far, and they could not afford to fail now. Together, they advanced toward the chair, the room seemingly closing in around them with each step. The figures in the shadows watched them, their hollow eyes unblinking. Lila reached out, her hand trembling as she touched the cold surface of the chair. And then, in that moment, the hotel's true nature was revealed to them. Not just a living entity, but a parasite. A creature that thrived on their fear, their pain, and their suffering. It was a creature that had been feeding for centuries, and now it was ready to consume them completely. They were at the very heart of it, and the choice was clear: destroy it, or become its next victims. With one last glance at Derek, Lila made her decision. They weren't going to be consumed. They weren't going to be another soul lost to this accursed place. It was time to end it. The final confrontation with the hotel was upon them, and Lila and Derek stood in the heart of the darkness, the chair before them pulsating with an energy that felt almost alive. It had been weeks since they had first set foot in this place, and now they stood at the precipice of an impossible choice: to escape or to end the hotel's reign of terror once and for all. Their journey had been harrowing, each twist more painful than the last, with no promises of safety or salvation. But this was it, the culmination of all their suffering, all their sacrifice. They had reached the final threshold, and now the only thing left was to decide if they would walk away or confront the heart of the malevolent entity that had ensnared them. The room was silent except for the soft hum of the chair, a sound that seemed to reverberate through their bones. It was a strange thing, this hum. It was soothing, almost comforting, like the lullaby of something ancient and timeless. But Lila knew better. It was the lullaby of a predator, one that fed on despair and fear, on everything human. It was calling them, pulling them closer, beckoning them toward the final unraveling. Lila stepped forward, her heart pounding in her chest. She had spent so long running from the hotel's grasp, trying to understand its cryptic intentions, trying to survive. And now, finally, she understood. The hotel was not just a place. It was a force, a creation of some primal darkness that thrived on suffering. But it was also a reflection of their deepest fears, of all the things they had tried to escape in life, the regrets, the mistakes, the failures. It was a mirror to their own insecurities, and it fed on their attempts to flee. Derek, standing by her side, was equally apprehensive but resolute. His hand brushed hers in a silent gesture of solidarity, as though they both understood that they were no longer just two people lost in a maze of terror. They were the final line of defense against a force that threatened to consume everything they had left. He had been with her through it all, and though he had never fully understood the nature of the hotel, he had come to see the truth. The hotel would never release them, never let them go unless they confronted it directly, unless they shattered the very core of its existence. The chair before them began to hum louder, its vibrations intensifying. It was as though the hotel itself was aware of their presence, of their intention. Lila could feel the air growing colder, the walls of the room warping and shifting, closing in around them. It was as if the hotel was trying to trap them, to suffocate them with its ever-encroaching power. The darkness seemed to grow deeper, more oppressive. But Lila wasn't afraid anymore. She had lived in fear for too long. Fear of being lost, of being consumed, of being trapped in a cycle she could never escape. She had learned that fear was a prison, a trap more powerful than any physical walls the hotel could build. And in that moment, she knew that to truly escape, to truly break the cycle, they had to confront the source of their fear, the place where it all began. Derek, seeing the shift in her, nodded silently. There was no more talking, no more searching for answers. This was the end. They had come this far, and now they had to fight, not just for their lives, but for their very souls. Lila reached out and touched the chair, her fingers brushing against the cold, smooth wood. As soon as she made contact, the hum stopped, and an eerie silence enveloped the room. The shadows receded, and for a brief moment, Lila thought she could feel the hotel's very essence shudder. It was as if the entire building had held its breath, waiting for her next move. Suddenly, the room seemed to collapse inward, the walls pressing down around them with an unbearable force. The air was thick, suffocating, and Lila could hear the faint whispers of voices, those lost souls trapped within the hotel, begging for release. The pressure on her chest grew stronger, but she held firm. She would not be like them. She would not let this place consume her. With a sharp intake of breath, she pulled the chair from its position in the center of the room, dragging it across the floor toward the darkened corner. It wasn't just the chair that needed to be destroyed. It was the heart of the hotel itself. She had to sever the connection, sever the thread that bound the hotel to the darkness that sustained it. With Derek's help, they managed to push the chair toward the farthest corner, where the walls seemed to fold in on themselves. She could feel the energy in the air, crackling like static electricity. In a sudden, desperate moment of clarity, Lila realized what had to be done. The chair was a conduit, yes, but it was also a symbol of their submission, of their willingness to surrender to the hotel's power. And the only way to sever that power was to destroy the symbol, to break it once and for all. Without another word, she grabbed a nearby piece of broken wood from the floor and slammed it into the back of the chair. The sound of splintering wood filled the room, and in that instant, the entire hotel seemed to shake. The walls groaned, the floor beneath their feet buckling. It was as if the hotel was being torn apart, its foundation crumbling under the force of their defiance. The whispers grew louder, the cries of the lost souls filling the air, but Lila did not falter. She kept smashing, each strike a declaration of resistance, each splinter of wood a symbol of their refusal to be trapped. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the chaos stopped. The room fell silent once more, the oppressive weight lifting from their chests. The walls stopped shifting, the air cleared, and the ground beneath their feet solidified. The chair was destroyed, its pieces scattered across the floor. For the first time since they had entered the hotel, Lila felt a sense of peace, a stillness that had eluded her for so long. The hotel was no longer alive. The cycle had been broken. With a final glance at Derek, Lila stepped toward the door. There were no more illusions, no more tricks. They had faced the heart of the hotel and emerged victorious. The hotel, its power drained, was now nothing more than a hollow shell, a crumbling monument to the terror it once held. And as they left the room, the whispers faded into nothing, leaving only the faintest echo of the journey they had survived. They were free.